My name is Charles Winston, originally from London, but now living in the heart of Paris. I've spent years wandering the corridors of the Louvre, studying the great works that adorn its walls. It's a place where time stands still, where the past speaks through canvas and stone. Little did I know that one ordinary day in the Louvre would change the course of my life, ever. This is the story of how I met Celine. It was a late morning, and the Louvre was bustling with the usual crowd. Tourists, students, art lovers, all weaving through the grand halls. I remember standing before Liberty leading the people, lost in thought, when I accidentally bumped into someone. Papers flew everywhere, and I turned, flustered, to see a woman kneeling to gather them. She had auburn hair and a soft, curious smile that immediately caught my attention. "I'm terribly sorry," I said, kneeling to help. Her papers looked important, drafts of some sort. "No harm done," she said, her voice light and forgiving. I should have been paying more attention. When she stood up, our eyes met. There was something about her gaze, green, bright, alive with curiosity. It's strange how a single glance can change everything. I found myself offering to help her gather the remaining papers, and soon we were both laughing off the awkward moment. We introduced ourselves. Her name was Celine, a writer working on a piece about art and its influence on modern culture. I told her I was an art historian, and she seemed genuinely interested in my work. So, on a whim, I offered to show her around the museum, to which she enthusiastically agreed. As we walked through the galleries, admiring sculptures and paintings, a series of odd events unfolded. First, an alarm went off as we approached the Mona Lisa. It wasn't anything serious, but it created a moment of confusion. Then, later, a section of the museum was closed for maintenance, forcing us to take a detour. Through each minor disruption, Celine and I exchanged glances, and soon we were laughing, sharing our amusement at the unpredictability of the day. "Paris always seems to have a sense of humor," I said as we stood in front of a marble statue in the Greek wing. She smiled, her eyes lighting up as she responded, "And here I thought it was just me who noticed." Felt as though the universe was playing some kind of game, nudging us closer together with each twist of fate. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. By early afternoon, we found ourselves outside the Louvre, the day still young but already filled with moments I couldn't have anticipated. We decided to grab a coffee at a small cafe nearby. The air was crisp, and the Eiffel Tower stood tall in the distance, a perfect backdrop to the city's charm. We sat at a small table, sipping our coffee and talking about life, art, dreams, anything that came to mind. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as if we'd known each other for years. "Paris has a way of making everything feel enchanted," she said, staring out at the bustling street. "It does," I agreed, "as if the city itself is alive, breathing through its streets, its art, its history." She looked at me then, her expression softening. "And you? What's your story?" For the first time in a long while, I opened up. I told her about my love for art, how it had shaped my life. She listened intently, her eyes never leaving mine. I found myself wanting to know everything about her, to understand what made her heart beat just a little faster. There was something so easy, so natural, about being with her. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the city, we found ourselves back at the Louvre. The glass pyramid gleamed in the fading light, and I couldn't help but think how surreal the day had been. Standing there with Celine, the energy between us was undeniable. It was as if Paris itself had conspired to bring us together, to create this perfect day, this perfect moment, and I didn't want it to end. "I'm glad we met," I said, watching her face as the sunlight danced in her eyes. "Me too," she replied, smiling softly. "It feels like the beginning of something, doesn't it?" I couldn't argue with that. Without another word, I leaned in and she met me halfway. It wasn't a dramatic kiss, not something out of a movie, but it was real, and it was ours. As we pulled back, I knew this was only the start. There was a promise in the air, a sense of new beginnings. We parted ways that evening, but I knew we would see each other again. Looking back, I realized that day in the Louvre was more than just a series of random events. It was a story being written by fate. Paris, with all its beauty and history, had woven a new chapter into my life, one I hadn't seen coming. And at the center of it all was Celine, a stranger who had become so much more. Few months passed, and life with Celine felt like a dream. We often visited our favorite cafe just across from the Louvre, where we spent hours talking about art, love, and life. One evening, as we sat in that same cafe, Celine was mid-sentence when her voice faltered. Her face went pale, and she suddenly held her head with both hands. "Charles!" she cried, her voice filled with agony, before collapsing onto the table. My heart stopped. I shouted for help as I rushed to her side, holding her unconscious body. The cafe staff called an ambulance, and within minutes, we were racing through the streets of Paris. Celine lay motionless on the stretcher, her face pale, and my chest felt like it was being crushed. At the hospital, the doctors rushed Celine into the ER while I waited in the hallway, feeling utterly helpless. I called her mother, who arrived shortly after, frail and in a wheelchair. She was in her 60s and struggling with her own health issues, but the fear in her eyes matched my own. "She's had headaches before," her mother whispered through tears. "Since she was a child, but never like this." We sat together, her nephew by her side, and listened as the doctors ran tests, MRIs, CT scans, anything they could to find answers. Hours passed, and the weight of uncertainty was unbearable. Finally, Dr. Jacques Allard, the senior neurosurgeon, approached us. His face was grave as he delivered the news. Celine had a rare brain tissue disorder. There was a treatment, but it was risky. She could lose her memory forever. Her mother broke down in sobs, her hands trembling as she signed the consent forms. It was the only option, only chance to save her. I felt like my world was collapsing as they wheeled Celine into surgery. I tried to comfort her mother, but the words felt hollow. I stepped outside to the small garden next to the ward, collapsing onto a bench. For the first time in my life, I prayed. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in, begged him to save her. Couldn't lose her. Not now. The surgery lasted 6 long hours. I paced the hallways, my thoughts dark and clouded. What if she never woke up? What if she didn't remember me? Finally, Dr. Allard emerged, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We've done our part," he said softly. "Now we wait." I visited the ICU, where I could only see Celine through a window. She was surrounded by machines, her face peaceful, so still it scared me. Her mother was too ill to stay, so I sent her home to rest, promising to keep vigil over her daughter. I leaned against the glass, watching Celine, praying that she would wake up. 24 hours passed, and still no sign of movement. I hadn't left the ICU's window, my eyes trained on Celine. Nurses and doctors came and went, checking her vitals, but she remained unconscious. Each passing hour was torture. Then, as I stood by her bed, something miraculous happened. I felt her fingers twitch. I blinked, hardly daring to hope, but then her eyelids fluttered, and her eyes slowly opened. She looked around, disoriented, before her gaze settled on me. "Charles?" she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable. A flood of relief and joy washed over me, and tears streamed down my face. "Celine, I knew you'd come back," I said, my voice choked with emotion. She smiled faintly, her voice barely a whisper. "I had to. Come back to you." In that moment, everything I had feared disappeared. Celine had come back to me, and despite the risks, the surgery had been a success. Our love, tested by fate, had survived. As I stood by her bedside holding her hand, I realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Paris, the city of love, had given me the greatest gift of all, Celine. And as I looked into her eyes, I knew that our story, far from over, had just begun.